Welcome to the largest black hat ever. I say that every year. I'm just going to take a recording of myself. And it starts to make me really wonder, where does this all end? Because I really feel that we are all employed for life. I mean, we really can keep doing this forever because as far as I see problems and challenges. And so on one hand, I'm really excited. On the other hand, I just want to sleep sometimes, you know? So this is our 18th black hat. And we've second year at the Mandalay Bay. And every year, I do a little bit of talking about the statistics of how many people show up, how many countries are represented. So I'm just going to get that out of the way before I move into some of my remarks. And so, 102 countries represented. That's a pretty good proportion of the planet is here around you. And 20 of those countries have only sent a single person. And you can guess who the biggest countries are. United States and... Come on, who's the second country? China? No. I would have guessed Canada, but it turns out to be the UK. Yeah, so they don't count. Yeah, so we have a lot of representation, and we also have some new things that we've been doing this year. Last year we announced our academic scholarship program, where we are trying to get more students involved from computer science programs around the country. And so to get a crack at a free admission to Black Hat, you write a white paper about a security topic, and it gets submitted, and they all get reviewed. And we don't really have a cap on how many we accept right now. And so this year, we accepted 153 that we thought were interesting enough. Yeah, so if you're in the audience and you're in here on that program, let's hear it. Come on, guys. So now this is your time to make the most of it, right? Take advantage of every opportunity you have, because next year we're probably not going to accept your writing. It might be a one-time offer. We also, for the second time, are doing a donation to the EFF. And the EFF has really been involved in a lot of legal battles over the years, and sometimes you agree with them and sometimes you don't agree with them, but what you can agree on is that they're dedicated and they're motivated and they get results and they understand our community. And there's not that many other legal groups that really understand us, go out of their way to reach out to us and to involve us in their process. And so we're doing another $50,000 donation for the work they do on behalf of not just our speakers, but also on behalf of our community. So I want to thank EFF for that and their good work this year. So I have a couple of remarks. You can see how well they've been laid out. And so for the theme this year, I was trying to think of, how have I been feeling this last year about the direction, not just of the United States, but the direction of information security in general. And it's really feeling to me like a pendulum. A pendulum has been swinging and it's accelerating. It started maybe a couple years ago. And what's happening, I think, is when I started off in information security, when I was a hacker, it was not illegal to pirate software. How many people were alive back then or took advantage of that loophole, right? Non-commercial copyright infringement was not illegal. You could not make a profit off somebody else's work, but you could enjoy it yourself for no profit. How far we've come, right? Now they're talking about mandatory minimum sentencing in the UK for software piracy. So in the course of about 20 years, well, actually, in the United States, non-commercial piracy changed, and the case started essentially in about 1994, and by 1997, with that NET Act, it became illegal. So less than 20 years ago, it was legal. So on one side of the pendulum, and here we are today. And if you take that metaphor and you start looking around, you can see it in many areas. Very little legislation, lots of legislation today. And so when I was making notes to talk about, I realized that everything that's happening now, we are in the middle of. We're the gatekeepers on this. We're going to be the trusted advisors. They want to understand what the implications for Internet of Things liability is, what's possible. We're the people building it, or we're the people securing it. We're going to have to be the ones that are advising on it. Is it possible to remote update 100 million Internet of Things devices? We're going to be the ones that are sort of in the middle of that. Are there security implications? So you might not think that you're going to be in this battle, but you're going to be pretty central to this fight over the next 5 to 10 years. And make no mistake, what we decide, what happens in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to live with for the next 30. And so you really have to start thinking a little bit more broadly about what you're working on, where you're donating your time, and what kind of world you want this to be. You can see this just with the crypto wars starting all over again. Mandatory backdoors, golden keys. Like, these are not new concepts to us, but they're new concepts to the new players. And we have to bring some perspective and some history to let them know why it wasn't a good idea then and why it's not a good idea now. Even worse idea now. So if you think about it, we have insurance coming on the scene. Cyber insurance is going to suck up maybe a quarter to a third of your budget in the next, say, 5 to 10 years. That's not going to make you any more secure. It's not going to patch any of your routers. But when your routers do fail or get hacked, you're going to have some insurance, right? A classic risk avoidance strategy. But how are you still going to do your job if some of your budget is moved to insurance? You're going to have to play in a world where there's more regulation, there's more insurance, there's more involvement of the legal system. So, for example, I ask people this, and I haven't gotten a good answer. So, if you can tell me an answer to this question, I'll put it in my brain, I'll think about it, and I'll write something on why, when your company is under attack, do you not employ all the tools at your disposal? Right? You deploy your technical tools, but how many of your companies have actually gone out and sued someone for attacking you? It's really rare. But if you think about it, in any other instance, you would be deploying lawyers, intellectual property theft, disgruntled employees, competitors stealing. But in certain areas, when we're being hacked, we don't deploy our lawyers. Why is that? They're sort of like our army. Governments have armies. They have state departments. As a company, you don't have any of that. You don't have the law on your side that allows you to use force. All you've got is civil law. Why aren't you using civil law? Right. I think that's going to become a bigger component in your toolbox in the future. You're going to start having to reach into that box and use it. So you should start getting familiar with what tools you can use. Another one I'm thinking about is liability. This was not a concern of ours 20 years ago. It's going to be a big concern for us going forward. Do you think that we can solve all of our problems that we're facing in security and the ones we have in the future if there is no software liability? I hate saying this, but I do not see a way forward without software liability. It's just going to be more of the same as far as you can see. It'll be like turtles all the way down, right? No software liability of any, it could be $1, it could be $10. I'm not saying it has to be punitive. I'm just saying if normal legal functions are not injected into the process, we're going to just have more of the same. Can you imagine Boeing or Airbus or Tesla? They're essentially moving data centers, flying through the sky. Yeah, they're data centers with wings or wheels, but they're data centers. And they operate under liability, right? They have some pretty strict software liability around their moving data centers. But an Oracle data center without wheels, no liability. So do you think, I don't know, someone like an Elon Musk or someone at Boeing, they're going to feel that they're in a great competitive situation where everything they do requires so much more engineering and liability protection, but over there, the Microsofts and Oracles of the world, no protection? No, I think they're going to want a level playing field at some point, and it's going to become competitive. And so I think even if we do nothing, market forces are going to start driving us toward liability. Well, what's that going to mean for you and for the way you run your business? And so just more and more of these issues are coming ripe. And so for that reason, when we were looking for a keynote this year, I was trying to think of someone that encompasses the big perspective, the long view, that's familiar, maybe a little bit more with the legal side, and maybe a little bit less with the technical or the geopolitical side, to really kind of help us understand what these big shifts in social direction, legal direction, what this means. And so for that, we have Jennifer Granick as our keynote. And I first met Jennifer at DEF CON 2, I believe. And we were talking about it back there. It's like how, besides being a rare occurrence of a woman at a hacking conference 20 years ago, I can't imagine, was I hitting on her? How did I meet her? And no, it turns out she was signing in and she put her name down and she put lawyer. And I was so excited that there was a lawyer there. And of course, everybody always wants free advice from a lawyer, so I started talking to her and we just stayed in touch. And over the years, Jennifer became the go-to person. I mean, if anybody in the scene anywhere got in trouble, Jennifer was there to help. She was a defense attorney. And I remember one point, if you remember Peter Shipley, who invented war driving, he was being accosted by the hotel because he was doing something with Mylar balloons, and she busts into the hotel security and pulls out her little bar association ID. And she's like, "I'm his attorney, let him go." And she is not afraid of controversy. She's helped, over the years, Max Butler was involved in his case. Mike Lynn, 10 years ago, she was involved with. The MTBA charge card hackers, helping them. Kevin Polson helped Weave. She helped Aaron Schwartz. She's even helped me several times. I mean, she's really helped everybody. So that's why I'm so proud to have her finally on stage. And to introduce her, I am equally proud to reintroduce you to Philippe Courteau, Chairman and CEO of Qualys. And Qualys has been a sponsor of Black Hat since about probably 1999. I mean, they've had a long view. And back then, it was no cloud, it was SaaS. I think SaaS had just been sort of invented as a term. And so they were offering their services SaaS. And then the cloud came along, so they had to rebrand. So now they're offering their security in the cloud. But you know how the technology is. It's essentially the same stuff. But what's different, I think, maybe with what I see from Qualys is that they're making their stuff more accessible, and they're offering more free services. So you can sort of get your toehold in and play around with their stuff. And I asked him what his long-term goal is. I mean, what's after cloud? If it was SaaS, cloud, mobile, SaaS cloud, mobile select cup, those acronyms don't work. But really what it is, they're trying to basically build security, simple security into the fabric of the cloud. So it's just sort of as a background. And if it was coming from somebody else that doesn't have almost a 15-year track record with us, I wouldn't really give him a lot of credit. But for Philippe, I'll give him a lot of credit for the long-term visionary view. So with that, I want to see how Philippe makes his entrance on the left here. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Jeff, for this very nice word. And it's always an honor and a pleasure for me to have the opportunity of introducing our keynote speaker. And this because Black Hat is very special. It's very special to me because I think it brings the best minds and the best hearts in our industry, so we can continue moving forward. And I think this is very important, in fact, especially now in 2015. 2015, which I believe we may end up calling the year of the mega breach, in reference to the Office of Personnel Management. But also, I believe it's a pivotal year for all of us, because in fact, I think there's not one, but two mounting challenges in front of us, and which are, as we well know, on one hand, cybersecurity, and on the other hand, privacy. And when you think it through, it's not possible to disassociate both of them. And this because, in fact, they represent our digital freedom and the digital freedom of our children. And it's with this in mind that I'm very honored and pleased to introduce our speaker, a lady and a lawyer, which in fact dedicated her career to our digital freedom. And also, as Jeff mentioned, a lady and a lawyer who also was, since the very beginning of our industry, became known as the first person that hackers call. So with that, I'm really very happy to introduce Jennifer Granick, which is the Director of Civil Liberties at the Stanford Center for Internet and Society. Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really excited to be here. I think I've come to almost every Black Hat since the show started, and it's a real honor to be invited to be the keynote. So it was 20 years ago that I started coming to these events and that I went to DEF CON. And I was interested in going to DEF CON because I believe in the dream of a free and open internet. And I believe that we want a world where information is freely accessible. And I believe in the freedom to tinker, the hands-on imperative that people should be able to study, manipulate, reverse engineer the devices and the software that define the world around us, that's what it means to engage with and to understand our world. And I went to DEF CON because I wanted to be part of making these dreams true, and as an attorney, I thought I could use my services to protect hackers, the people who were making this world happen, from the predations of law. But today, that dream of internet freedom that brought me to DEF CON 20 years ago is dying. And it's dying because nobody's murdering the dream, but it's dying because, for better or for worse, we've started to prioritize other things. We've put other values ahead of openness and freedom. We are looking at security, online civility, improving the user interface, protecting intellectual property interests, and we're valuing these above freedom and openness. And so, through neglect and other evolutionary trends, what we're seeing is an internet that is less open and more centralized. We're seeing an internet that is more regulated. We used to not have very much regulation, now we do. And in terms of where these rules are coming from, we're seeing an internet where the United States' dominance over the network is fading, and other countries are getting in on the regulatory business. And this is really important because the next billion internet users are going to come from countries that don't have a Bill of Rights, that don't have a First Amendment. And it's going to be those governments that are getting in the business of regulating the internet. So these trends are accelerating. We can see them now, but they're accelerating. And what I think this means is that the dream today is in danger, but we can kind of see forward into the future and what the future will look like 20 years from now. And 20 years from now, you won't necessarily know anything about the decisions that are made that affect your life and your rights. The software is going to compute on data, and it's going to decide whether you get a loan, whether you get a job, whether a car runs over you or drives off a bridge. And these things are going to happen, and you are not going to know why, and maybe the people who designed the software aren't going to know why either. Now, when the public learns about these things, how are we going to feel? Well, it's going to work well enough. It's going to work well enough. And what's going to happen is that there's going to be a lot of mistakes, but the mistakes are going to be on the edge cases. And as long as those mistakes disproportionately affect edge cases and minorities, people are going to accept this state of affairs. But that's not okay, because it's the edge cases and the minorities that are the ones that are the innovators, that are the early adopters, that are the first movers, that are the ones that evolve our society forward. The internet's going to become more like TV. Instead of this global conversation that we envisioned 20 years ago and that attracted many of us to computers. And rather than technology being revolutionary and overturning existing power structures, we're seeing that technology is being used to reinforce existing power structures. This is particularly true in security. People want and need a certain level of safety online. But what we've learned is that people are not able to protect themselves. And so the idea of security has been centralized. Companies and devices need to provide security to the public. Now, that's not working well enough, but that is the enterprise that everybody here is engaged in trying to provide. But when we centralize in order to achieve that goal of security, what happens is we create these choke points where regulation can happen. And we're seeing that regulation in things like push for crypto backdoors. The regulation is going to be done by governments that have domestic, national, local concerns, not global concerns. It's going to be influenced by elites and people with money and companies with money. And so powerful groups are going to get to decide who gets security and who doesn't. And then finally, we see that, Finally, we see that the way that the internet is currently operating for technological and for business reasons, instead of routing around censorship, is actually facilitating surveillance, censorship, and control. It doesn't have to be this way. But if we're going to change things, we need to start doing it now. And it needs to start with us asking some difficult questions and making some hard decisions. What's it going to mean when computers know everything about us and computer algorithms make life and death decisions? Should we be worrying more about another terrorist attack in New York, or about the ability of journalists and human rights workers around the world to do their jobs? How do we value and weigh those two things? How much free speech does a free society really need? We see that technology has created this golden age of surveillance. Can we also use technology to readjust the balance of power between people and governments so that we can have some privacy back? Given that decisions by private companies are going to be determining individual rights, how can the public interest be communicated into that process? How can we democratically control what these important platforms and private companies do without squelching innovation? Who is responsible for digital security? Is it the US government? Is it government's role? Is it private responsibility for corporations? And what is going to become of the dream of internet freedom? Now, thank you. For me, the dream of internet freedom began in 1984 when I read Stephen Levy's book, Hackers, in which he talks about the computer scientists and the engineers who built the early internet. And these people had a value called the hacker ethic. And the hacker ethic was that information should be freely accessible. The hacker ethic was the hands-on imperative, that people should be free to manipulate, change, modify, study, reverse engineer the technology around them. And the hacker ethic was built into the technology itself. The decentralization was a design principle that had a political impact. And the important thing about decentralization is that it empowered people to make their own decisions about what was right and wrong. Decentralization was built into the very DNA of the early internet, where it would be dumb pipes, smart edges, and the innovation could take place and the network would run it. And the idea was that we would have this global network, and the global network would allow us to communicate with anyone, anywhere, anytime. And that would bring us all of the hopes and dreams and glories that the human mind and heart could dream up. I wanted to live in that world. And that idea that we could be in charge of our intellectual destinies and that technology would help carried with me to college, when I went to college. And my college, it was New College, a liberal arts school in Sarasota, Florida. Do I have any new collegians here? Oh, too bad. Yay! So New College is a place where the motto of the school is that everybody in the final analysis is responsible for his or her own education. And it was around that time that I read the Hacker Manifesto in Frack magazine, written by the mentor. And I learned from that hackers were a lot like my fellow academic nerds at New College. We were tired of being fed intellectual baby food. We wanted to take responsibility for our own lives. We thought that information should be freely available and that we should be able to communicate and think freely. We we mistrusted authority, and we wanted to change the world. And we wanted to live in a place where, in the mentor's own words, we would exist without skin color, without nationality, without religious bias, just based on the quality of our thoughts. So this is what I was into when I started using the internet in 1991. And I remember the day that everything clicked for me. I had a small ISP called HoloNet, and I needed some help. I didn't know what I was doing. So I asked a question of the system administrator. And he started to respond to my question, and I could see him typing and those letters, one by one, appearing on the screen that I was looking at. And this just connection over the technology. And it made me realize viscerally, for the first time, that this idea that we could talk to anyone or everyone in real time could be a reality. So 20 years ago, when I became a criminal defense attorney, I had this love of technology. And I learned that hackers were getting in trouble for doing things that I thought were pretty cool tricks. One of the instances was that really affected me was I was a legal aid person for the San Francisco Sheriff's Department working in the jail and giving people legal advice and representation. And one of the jail inmates was looking at having all of his jail credit time taken away because he had been basically hooting into the payphone and getting himself and all of his pod mates free phone calls home. And I was like, you're going to take his time away for that? I think that's pretty cool. And as I was investigating the case, that's how I learned that hackers were getting in trouble for all kinds of things. And there were all these laws out there that were impacting the hacker ethic. And I thought, as a lawyer, I should get involved and maybe I could help. So this was also the same year that the Internet Civil Liberties Wars really started in earnest. At least from a legal perspective. That year, 1985, a guy named Marty Rim wrote a study saying that the internet was running rampant with pornography. And a law journal published the story, and then Time magazine did this cover story on it. And the cyber porn scare was off and running, and there's nothing that gets Congress more excited about doing something than the scourge of pornography. So Congress quickly passed this law, the Communications Decency Act of 1996, the CDA. Okay, and this was an attempt to regulate online pornography. Now, for those of you who are pornography fans out there, this is already a bummer. But it was actually worse than that. Because in order to regulate pornography, the government had to argue that the internet wasn't going to be fully protected by the First Amendment. So the internet was going to be more like TV and less like a library. Okay? And it was worse than that, because we had bigger hopes for the internet than that it would be a library. The internet was better than a library, because on the internet, everyone can be a creator too. On the internet, it's global. And on the internet, unlike in a library or a bookstore, everything is always on the shelves. So this idea that we would take this promise and basically cut its legs off so early on was anathema. We were very upset. So what happened was, so at that point, I think a lot of people became activated. And at that point, enter John Perry Barlow, lyricist for the Grateful Dead, rancher, founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a great man who's lived a wonderful life. Barlow's been in the hospital these past couple of weeks, so I send a shout out to him, and I hope people will keep him in their thoughts. What Barlow wrote was, as could be expected, lyrical. And what he wrote was revolutionary. It was really a revolutionary document, the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. And in it, Barlow wrote, "Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather." Now, Barlow was reacting to the CDA and the assertion that the internet should be less free than books and magazines. But he was also expressing a weariness, and I think it was a weariness that a lot of us shared with business as usual. He was expressing a hope that the internet would be able to place our reading, our friendships, our very thoughts beyond government control. And it was, maybe naive and maybe a little bit radical, but the core there, I think, attracted a lot of people and definitely attracted me. So, as it turned out, Marty Rim and the Communications Decency Act did not kill the internet. In fact, it's a little bit ironic, because what ended up happening was, in the lawsuit challenging the CDA, the Supreme Court struck down almost every part of the law. The Supreme Court said the First Amendment applies fully and completely to the internet. But there's one part of the CDA that the court did not strike down. And that part seems to be, read alone, sort of the opposite of what Congress's goal was in passing the CDA, because it said that online service providers don't have to police the content on their services and can't get in trouble for content except in these certain specific categories. So the idea there is that, you aren't the provider doesn't have to be a policeman. And together, the hacker ethic, the hacker manifesto, the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, ACLU versus Reno, the Supreme Court case, and this part of the CDA describe what's a more or less radical dream, depending on who you are, but it's one that many, if not most of us in this room, share or shared, and maybe have even spent our lives working for. So, the dream is that we overcome age, race, class, and gender. The dream is that we can communicate with anyone, anywhere, at any time. This enhanced individual liberty. The dream is that we will have freer access to information. And the dream is the hands-on imperative, the freedom to tinker, that we will be able to study, know, and ultimately understand the devices around and software around us. The dream in some was that computers were going to make our lives more free and better. But I'm here to tell you today that this dream of internet freedom is dying. And if you look from here at the trends and look 20 years on, it doesn't just look like the internet could be a lot less revolutionary than we had hoped. It looks like in a lot of ways it might be a lot worse. Today, we've seen that race, gender, class are more than resilient enough to thrive in the digital world. We've seen that our ability to communicate with anyone, anywhere, is being limited by both government control and corporate policies about what speech is acceptable online. We've seen the free access to information also limited, particularly by our ability to study software and hardware around us. So many laws now interfere with what computer hackers do and reverse engineering. And so the question that's left is, will computers liberate us? Is that dream still possible? Now, I want to talk first about equality. Race, gender, and class discrimination are proving remarkably resistant to change. Now, I have to say, this has not been my experience. Being here at DEF CON and at Black Hat, being part of the world of computer security, I've always felt respected and I've always felt welcome. But there's too much evidence that other people's experiences are not the same. And I want to just illustrate this with one simple set of statistics. At Google, 30% of their workforce is female, but only 17% of the people in tech jobs are. At Facebook, that number is 15%, and at Twitter, it's 10%. So we're very far away from equality. My other piece of evidence is anecdotal. This field in particular has a reputation for being overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly white. Now, I have never understood why that's true. Because from what I've seen, the hacker community is unbelievably great at recognizing talent and skill in unconventional candidates. I mean, we have people who are unbelievably successful who never finished college, never mind high school. We have people all over the autism spectrum who are doing incredibly well. Age is irrelevant. I mean, Aaron Swartz, when he was 15 years old, hung out with Doug Engelbart, the creator of the mouse. Inclusion is the very heart of the hacker ethic and community. And I think we have a choice. We can kind of persist the way that we have been going, or I think this field could really be a leader and take leadership in evolving a more equal society, starting with security. I think we'd have to conscientiously try to do so and try to cultivate that talent, though. Next, I want to talk about the freedom to tinker. And when I say freedom to tinker, it sounds a little bit like a hobby, but I want to impress on people how important this is. Because it's not just an ability to go putter around in your garage. It's the ability to study, to modify, and ultimately to understand the technology around us. And as technology is more and more important, that understanding is necessary for a democratic society. And there are two things that are limiting our ability to the freedom to tinker. One of them is law, and one of them is just our natural human capacity to understand things. Now, there are many, many examples of how the law has interfered with the freedom to tinker, but I'm just going to give you two. It was exactly 10 years ago that Mike Lynn, who worked for ISS, was scheduled to give a talk about a new class of vulnerabilities in routers. And Lynn's employer, ISS and Cisco, the routers that he had studied, decided at some point that they did not want him to give the talk. And so they pressed Black Hat with threats of copyright lawsuits to actually rip the pages with Mike Lynn's slides out of the conference books and reprint and redo all of the CDs. I mean, there's nothing that looks more like censorship than people actually ripping pages out of books. So on stage the next morning, Mike got on stage, put on a white baseball cap, like literally a white hat, quit his job, and gave the original talk anyway. Now, I was Mike's lawyer in that case. And we successfully fought back the civil lawsuit for copyright infringement. We were able to fight back against the criminal investigation that the companies had implemented against him. But the message was loud and clear, and not just to Mike. The message was, this is our software, not yours. This is our router, not yours. You are just a licensee, and we will tell you what you're allowed to do, and you'll do just that and no more. You can't decompile this, you can't study it, and you can't tell anyone what you find. The other case I want to mention is the criminal prosecution for Computer Fraud and Abuse Act against my friend Aaron Swartz. Aaron got in trouble for writing a script that automated the download of academic journal articles. And he was authorized to access these articles, but he was doing it as a student at Harvard, but he was doing it really, really fast. Aaron was a hacker, and he challenged the system in all kinds of ways, and they went after him with a vengeance and charged him with CFAA and multiple counts, and he was looking at a lot of years. And the stress of the case ultimately contributed to his killing himself. But again, which is an unbelievable tragedy. But again, the idea that anything Aaron did was unauthorized to a computer scientist is crazy. But yet here too, the message was clear. You need our permission to operate in this world. If you step over the line, we will come for you. If you automate, if you download too fast, if you type something weird in the URL bar on your browser, or if we don't like what you do, or if we don't like you, then this law is vague enough that we can come and get you. Now, the question is, in the future, are we going to have the freedom to tinker? What would it take for us to change the path that we're on now? Well, first, Congress would have to stop this tough on cybercrime hand-waving and actually do something for real about cybersecurity instead of saying, oh, we're going to have bigger penalties under criminal law. No one cares about bigger penalties under criminal law. If you look at any of the big breaches that we've had over the past 2 or 3 years, there's been no criminal prosecutions in any of them. And, China or North Korea or whoever, is behind these breaches, we're not putting China or North Korea in prison. So what's happening, though, is that these heavy sentences are chilling the good guys, and they're not protecting people online. We'd also have to declare that users and software, so people who buy software, have the right to modify that software, and that laws like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act can't get in the way of that. So this is really important because in the next 20 years, we are going to have all these network devices. There's software in everything. It's true now, and it's just going to get more true. And if we're not allowed to study that, basically what it means is that we're going to just be surrounded by black boxes that do things that we can't understand. So we need to get rid of the CFAA, we need to get rid of the DMCA, we need to get rid of this idea that license agreements can limit what we do. There's a public interest in the freedom to tinker that needs to be protected. The other problem is the idea of, is our just natural intellectual limitation on understanding the world. So in the next 20 years, we're going to see these amazing advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence. And one of the things that's going to happen is that software is going to do stuff, and we're not going to really be able to understand why. Some of that opacity will be because we didn't write the software, but increasingly it may be that the very people who actually wrote the software don't know either. And a law professor, Frank Pasquale, wrote a book about this called The Black Box Society. And the idea of the book is that we are going to be surrounded, that algorithms are going to be making these life and death decisions about us, and we're not going to be able to understand them. Really, the first step to doing anything about something is to understand it, is transparency. And transparency is actually going to become increasingly hard. So you take secrecy, you take profit motive, you add a couple 100 billion pieces of data about all of us, you shake, a result comes out, and that's what we live with. We need to think very hard about how do we take advantage of AI and machine learning without ending up in that kind of terrifying world. And part of that is talking about who's responsible when software fails, whose job it is. And so far, we've had almost no regulation of software. There have been very few cases, mostly where the vendor has misrepresented to the customers, what the software does. But people who, are not big into regulation are sick and tired of crappy software, and they're not going to take it anymore. And that feeling is going to be accelerated by the Internet of Things, because now we're going to have industries that are very used to products liability that are also software vendors. Autonomous cars that crash, somebody's going to sue. When your network toaster catches on fire, somebody's going to sue, and there's going to be software liability. We've already had Chrysler recall 1.4 million cars based on research that Charlie and Chris are going to talk about later today. So what's going to happen there when we have software liability? I think software liability is inevitable. I also think that it's necessary, but without question, it's going to make coding more expensive, and it's going to make coding more conservative. I think that we will do a very crappy job of imposing software liability for a very long time. And I think that the people who are going to suffer are going to be the innovators and the startups, and not the incumbents. So we have to pay a lot of attention to that and be worried. But it's going to happen, because it's a very short step from suing Tesla to suing Oracle with all the good and bad that will come of that. So next I want to talk about privacy and security and free speech. But we need to take a step back and talk a little bit about how we got here. And so I mentioned that when I was reading Stephen Levy's book, I was learning about the concept of the decentralized internet and the end-to-end principle. And the idea of the end-to-end principle was that was intentional. Innovation happens on the edges. And what that meant is that the internet would not just enable communication, the phone network did that, but that it would do it in a democratized, decentralized, radical way. Power to the people and not to the governments or companies that own the pipes. That model has evolved. It's evolved for business reasons, and it's evolved for technological reasons. Today, broadband users want to build smart pipes to enable quality of service, to do malware and spam filtering, and to have new business models where they can make more money off the fact that they control the network, that they control the underlying network. Today, hundreds of millions of people conduct their social interactions over highly centralized platforms like Tencent or Facebook. And so what does this mean for the public interest, this evolution away from end to end? If you haven't read Professor Tim Wu's book, The Master Switch, then you should. And in this book, Tim takes a look at the other great communications technologies of our lifetime: phones, radio, television, and movies. And what Tim says from studying the history of these technologies is that there's a cycle. And the cycle is this. History shows a progression of information technologies from somebody's hobby to somebody's industry, from a jury-rigged contraption to a slick production marvel. I'm thinking BBS to web here. From a freely accessible channel to one controlled strictly by a single corporation or cartel, from an open to closed system. Eventually, entrepreneurs or regulators smash apart the closed system, and the cycle begins anew. And Tim traces this cycle through these technologies, and then he asks the question that I'm asking you guys here today. Is the internet going to follow this cycle? Is the internet going to become centralized, strictly controlled, and closed? If we don't do things differently, the internet will end up like TV. And as I said, some of that is because we've neglected the goals of freedom and openness in favor of other values. But I think we have to recognize that some of it is because people have lost their allegiance to the dream of internet freedom. Some people will say, maybe even people in this audience, that the internet is not the utopia that I've made it out to be. Rather, the dream of internet freedom has clashed head-on with the ugly reality that other people can suck. Nasty comments, 4chan, betards, revenge porn, jihadists, Nazis. These things are so affecting the public sensibility about whether the internet is a nice place to be or not, that increasingly I even hear law professors, experts in the First Amendment, who are supposed to know about the chilling effect and the doctrine of overbreadth, talk about what's the best way to legislate this stuff that they don't like out of existence. Second are the trends that I told you about that are affecting the network. And these are centralization, regulation, and globalization. Centralization is a problem because it is a cheap and easy point for regulation, control, and surveillance. Regulation is on the rise. It is the exercise of government power in favor of local or domestic interests and private entities with economic power. It's just the reality of our system, and it's even more so in other places. And globalization means that other governments are going to get into the mix. Other governments who are not constrained by the First Amendment, who don't have a Bill of Rights, who maybe don't even have due process or the rule of law. Now, when I say that corporate control is a problem, it may sound like I'm blaming corporations. And when I say that the internet's becoming more closed because governments are censoring the internet, it may sound like I'm blaming governments. And I am. But I'm also blaming you, and I'm blaming me, because it's the things that we want that are driving these trends. So just as an example, who here ever had a blog? Does anybody ever have a blog? Okay, a couple of bloggers out there. Who here still blogs regularly? I don't. I post my updates on Facebook, the centralized server. Probably a lot of people in this room run their own email servers, but almost nobody else I know does. They all use Gmail. And they like Gmail because they like the user interface, they like the spam filtering, and they like the malware detection. I'm no different. When I had an iPhone, I didn't jailbreak it. I downloaded the pre-approved, A-OK apps from the App Store. I trusted Apple's judgment about what was secure and what was available. And I download apps now because I don't like the interface, the mobile interface on my mobile browser. And when they ask me to say yes to the permissions, I click yes because I want it to do what it's going to do. And so I give it access to all kinds of information about me. And I love it. I love when I'm at the store and my phone buzzes and reminds me that I need to get milk. I'm thrilled that it's ubiquitously tracking my location. Because otherwise no milk, and that'd be really bad. So my point is that we want lots of cool products in the cloud. But the cloud is such a terrible metaphor because a cloud is billions of little droplets of water. And the internet cloud isn't like that at all. The internet cloud is actually a finite and knowable number of companies that together have control over almost all of the internet that we use. and it's level 3 for fiber optics, or Amazon for servers, or Google for the search engine and for Android. And the fact that there are these choke points, these particular companies that are subject to government regulation, whether US or other, means that this is an opportunity, this more centralized cloud is an opportunity for control, for surveillance, and for regulation. And this isn't looking like it's going to change. So as things keep going in this direction, what does it mean for privacy, security, and freedom of expression? Well, privacy is essential to liberty, and that means that without privacy, the future will be less free. This is the golden age of surveillance. People know how much information technology today collects about you. But what you might not realize is this. Here's a quiz. What do emails, buddy lists, drive backups, social networking posts, your web browsing history, your bank records, your medical data, your fingerprints, your face prints, and your shedded DNA have in common? The answer is the Department of Justice doesn't think any of these are private, right? The Department of Justice's view is that these are all things that either happen in public or which you voluntarily reveal to service providers, and so there's no expectation of privacy, and the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply. Okay? And what that means is that as technology has proliferated all this data, the law hasn't stepped in to protect it. The law has utterly fallen short on the job. In fact, quite the opposite. The law is enabling surveillance in all kinds of ways. When we have these national security surveillance laws that are supposed to apply to foreigners in particular categories of information, but we've learned through secret interpretations of law that our government in the United States is actually using to spy on us. We have provider assistance provisions that the government is using, not just to say, well, you have this data, I'd like to get a hold of it, but to try to force companies to do things like turn over their encryption keys. We have lots of laws and more being proposed that will give corporate immunity for helping out the government and giving your data over, even when there's other laws, narrow laws, that would say, no, actually, this information is private. And increasingly, particularly in other countries, but we're going to see it here too, data retention obligations, where companies are going to be basically commissioned to be police officers and spies for governments. Now, you might think like, okay, well, there's got to be some law on this, right? We've had the internet for a while. Email's been around for a long time. But really surprisingly, there's actually only one case that's ever been decided on this from a regular public court. And it was in the Sixth Circuit, which is Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, and one other state. Sorry for the other state in the Sixth Circuit that I forgot. Kentucky, Tennessee, Michigan, and Ohio. Sorry, Ohio. As a result, but basically in this case, the Sixth Circuit said, okay, email is a communication. Communications are like phone calls. It's protected by the Fourth Amendment. And this case has been really important, but the Department of Justice, in public and in private, continues to say that it's wrongly decided and needs to be overturned. Now, I want to also take a moment to impress upon people, because you might not really get this not being lawyers, what a warrant means and how important it is. Now, a warrant means that a judge has to authorize the search. And basically, it's a guard against arbitrary government action. The police can't just come in and run rampant through your house or just investigate you for no reason. And that's important. But a warrant is also important because it requires you to specifically describe the place that's being searched and the things to be seized. So a warrant is also a guard against mass surveillance. When there's no warrant requirement, it means that searches can be arbitrary and massive, turned against everybody. So this is really important, but all this data is not being protected. So, with globalization, it really only makes things worse. And it's going to get worse as we see the Internet of Things and network devices. So, we've got the centralization problem. There's all this regulation, and countries are getting in on it. I mean, particularly now that other countries know how excessive the United States surveillance is, they want to have the same stuff. Next, I want to talk about security. We often talk about security as the opposite of privacy, but we know that that's not true. You can help security without invading privacy, like by locking cockpit doors. Sometimes to protect security, you need to protect privacy. A homosexual person in India or a human rights worker in Syria is safer because of privacy. One thing we don't talk about that much is the relationship of security to openness. As you lock down your network, as you make things more secure and, sign-ons and there's no more open Wi-Fi anymore and all of that, security has a tension with openness. But it's also true at the same time that if the network isn't secure and safe, people aren't going to use it. What good is an open network that's too dangerous to use? Those of us who try to check our email at DEF CON already know that. So the idea should have been that people can choose security when it's appropriate and choose openness at other times. Right? The fact that we need to secure the electrical grid or SCADA systems that control water doesn't mean we have to have closed Wi-Fi or that the government has to sit on the domestic network and spy on our email. But that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that in the name of security, we're having this greater exercise of power, particularly by the U.S. government, over our use of the network. And so instead of having a global view that security on the internet should be a rising tide that will float all boats, what we're seeing is this very provincial idea that security is cyber. And cyber means, in my usage, what General Hayden, former head of NSA and CIA, said it means, which is that the U.S. has the ability to use the network whenever we want, and we have the ability to deny that use to our adversaries. That does not sound like an open and reliable internet to me. That's not my internet. And so what that ends up meaning is that, instead of us protecting the security of everybody, the government wants to have crypto backdoors, sit on the network and do surveillance, be able to black out the internet in North Korea or wherever. And that means that there's going to be security haves and security have-nots. I think the better analogy for security to understand it is that increasingly we're seeing security becoming about power, where people in power want security for themselves and want to deny security to others. So if security is a power relationship, then people are going to lose. And the people who are going to lose are the vulnerable communities and the minorities and the religious minorities that actually need security most. And here in the United States, people don't care enough because we think, oh, we have the Bill of Rights and we have all of these laws that protect against discrimination. I think a lot of people know that those laws, like our privacy laws, do not work well enough. But certainly in other parts of the world, people don't have those safeguards. People don't have that security. And if we're not going to be a leader in providing it to them, then we're going to lose out on the democratic benefits and on the human rights benefits of providing security to everybody. But I don't hear that being the model from our government. Finally, I want to talk about freedom of expression. And just briefly, for all kinds of reasons, we've seen censorship on the internet, whether it's copyright or that sort of thing. But now that the physical architecture is so centralized, it's easier to control. So here's an example. Our government and the UN have started to ask platforms to police their networks for political speech. And now it's radical speech or terrorist speech, ISIS videos or jihadist things. But they're even starting to ask to watch out for people who are becoming radicalized. So I can tell you, if you look at what the FBI thinks are signs of radicalization, we have no idea. The FBI doesn't know, psychologists, nobody knows what makes somebody a radical and what makes somebody curious, what makes somebody have legitimate, non-violent political viewpoints and what makes somebody who's going to be dangerous and violent. But people aren't rebelling against this. I don't see people booing when Google says, okay, I'm going to, I'm going to take ISIS videos off of YouTube. People aren't upset about that. But so it's ISIS videos, then it's revenge porn. But we have to understand that these censorship decisions are inherently political, because we don't see the same call for racist speech or pictures of the Confederate flag or that kind of thing. And in the United States, we're not even seeing these laws that we can protest against. What we see is that the government or interest groups put pressure on the companies, and companies make these decisions because they want to have a service that appeals to the majority of their users, not to the edges, not to the fringe, not to the radicals. And so they censor, and most people don't care. But the end result of that is that for people, particularly new adopters around the world, these new adopters around the world, they don't really have a sense necessarily of the broader internet. There was a poll of internet users in Indonesia, and a lower percentage of people said they use the internet than said they use Facebook. They don't think about Facebook as using the internet. And a lot of the news stories I saw were like, isn't that funny? They don't really know that Facebook is the internet. And I actually had the opposite reaction, which was Facebook is not the full internet. Facebook is a community, a narrower community that allows you to do particular things, shows you particular information based on what Facebook thinks you're going to like. But it doesn't give us that global conversation. It doesn't give us that radical freedom. It doesn't have everything on the shelf. So what does this mean for the next 20 years? In the next 20 years, things will happen, and no one will really know why. You will be more ignorant about the world around you. In the next 20 years, you'll mostly feel okay about it. People will mostly accept it because it's going to affect minorities and edge cases, and it's going to work okay. It's going to work okay, and the internet is still cool, so we're still going to have enough good stuff. The internet's going to become a lot more like TV. We're going to be watching videos and consuming, and we're not really going to be able to reach that global audience. I mean, even if you have a blog now, to reach a global audience, you need search engine optimization and CDNs and all of that stuff. It's not the level playing field that we once thought it would be. And existing power structures are going to be continued, replicated, and strengthened, whether that's in the field of security, in the field of surveillance, or in the field of censorship. Or we have an alternative. We could think globally instead of locally and nationally about what we would want. Yes, we need to guard against more terrorist attacks in New York, but we cannot ignore the impact that something like crypto backdoors would have on journalists and human rights workers around the world. We can start thinking about technology as something where we want to build decentralization back in where possible. Give that power back to the people where we can. And part of restoring that balance of power is end-to-end encryption. We need end-to-end encryption so that when the government needs your data, instead of secretly going to level 3 or to Google or to Microsoft or to Apple, they have to come to us for it. We need to have the government have hands off of private technology development. It is not the government's business to tell us how to design networks to be surveillance friendly. It's our business to try to create technology that will give people the tools they need to have a better life and a freer life. We need to start being afraid of the right things. Humans are really bad at understanding risk. People are way more afraid of sharks than they are of cows, but cows kill something like 8 times more people a year than sharks do. It's true. Look it up. The most dangerous thing we do every day is get in a car. By far, the most dangerous thing we do every day. So we need to start being afraid of the right things. We need to learn, what to accept, and we need to address the right problems. We need to modify our laws to be better. We need to get rid of the computer crime law the way it's written. We need to modify the DMCA so it doesn't interfere with security research. We need to look at provisions of the Patriot Act and revise those, as well as other foreign intelligence surveillance laws, and we need to do away with secret law. We have secret law in this country, and it is an abomination in the face of a democracy to have that. Thank you. At the same time, privacy isn't dead. I mean, we may have all this technology collecting information, but we can use law to provide safeguards where technology can't, but we won't do it. Why don't we amend the Electronic Communications Privacy Act to protect your email fully? Why don't we amend the Electronic Communications Privacy Act to protect our geolocation data? These are very simple, basic proposals, but Congress won't do it. We have to get behind it and we have to push. Now, there's a possibility that these provisions, and these are just a few ideas, but there's a possibility that these things aren't going to work, that these ideas aren't going to work. And what that means is that in the next 20 years, instead of seeing the dream of internet freedom become true, we're going to see it get sicker and sicker and sicker until it finally dies. And then the internet is going to be this slick, stiff, controlled, closed thing. It'll be good, it'll be better than TV and radio, but this is what it'll be. And if that's true, then what we need to do in the next 20 years is we need to get ready. And we need to get ready to smash it apart and make something new and better. Thank you.
Yay, Jennifer. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay, I just have some quick housekeeping announcements, and then we're going to kick off the rest of the show. Right here in the middle aisle, we're pulling that air wall, and we're dividing this room into two. So on one side, on your right, you're going to see Patrick Wardle writing bad malware for OS X. And then on the other side, we're going to see Adrian Ludwig's talk on Android security state of the union. So if you stay in the middle for too long, you'll get sliced in two. Try to go out around the sides. Thank you very much. See you guys around.